okay, of hypertonia, okay, and how we are going to manage hypertonia, and more than like how we are going to manage. What I want you to understand is to make an informed decision. That is, your decision to treat must be based upon the knowledge of the exact physiology of what is happening, or what your treatment is going to do to the patient's body or muscles. Okay, so that is what we are going to see. So to start with, this diagram you would have seen in your physiology textbooks, you would have come across this multiple times. And I believe that most of the people just skip this diagram, because to look at itself is quite scary. But ultimately, this is essentially what we are dealing with, in fact. So it looks confusing, it looks scary, so let me just try to simplify this in a manner, so that it's easier for us to understand. So first we'll see what exactly is tone. Okay, now if you happen to move a joint, okay, if you happen to move a joint passively or by any means, if a joint is moved, the resistance which is offered by the muscles which are antagonistic to that movement. For example, if you are trying to extend your elbow from a flex position, the flexors of the elbow are antagonistic to that movement. The resistance which is offered by the muscles to a passive stretch or elongation, what you're trying to do is a passive stretch or elongation, or that is what basically a muscle tone is. It amounts to a tension that a muscle has at rest. Now, tone is very important because our body is subjected to different kinds of perturbation at all points of time. Okay, so we are under the influence of gravity, we are under the influence of the perturbations which are offered by the variations in atmospheric pressure, environmental stimuli of bumping against objects, against sinking into a seat or mattress or whatever. We are always under various kinds of perturbations which essentially can compromise our stability or biomechanical stability. Okay, and the muscles need to have offer a minimal resistance, okay, to a movement which can be caused by these perturbations. Okay, and at rest it is basically tone, which can be regulated in a way that it increases or decreases so as to stop a perturbation, okay, or a movement from occurring. So muscle tone can be physiologically summed up as a state of partial isometric contraction maintained by continuous activity of alpha motor neurons. So when you talk about muscle tone, the most common phenomenon which comes into your mind would be posture, which is maintained through the reflex adjustments of tone of anti-gravity muscles, to put it simply. Okay, so here in this diagram, I have only spoken about one motor neuron, that is the alpha motor neuron. Okay, now you can see that the alpha motor neuron basically supplies the extrafusal fibers of the muscle. Now extrafusal fibers are those fibers which essentially through tendon are going to apply a force on or between the bony segments which they are connected to, and can bring about movement. Okay, so those are extrafusal muscle fibers. Now alpha motor neuron basically is innervating the extrafusal muscle fibers. So whenever you're talking about tone, it is essentially a alpha motor neuron input into the muscle. Okay, so that is being activated, and that essentially is is basically causing a state of partial muscle contraction. Okay, now as isometric that too. Now the question is that what is the role of this gamma motor neuron? Okay, and then we have put another picture there of intrafusal muscle fiber. So I don't know how many of you are there right now in the meeting. So can anybody tell what is gamma motor neuron? Anybody who is Nancy? How many people are there in the meeting? Approximately. Am I audible? Hello. Okay. Nancy, is my screen still visible to you?
Yes, sir. Your screen is visible, but presentation is,
Okay,
I
so
guess
once again,
you have minimized your presentation.
okay,
Yes,
just
yes,
a second,
fine,
just
fine.
a second.
Now you can continue. Thank you.
Can you see my presentation now?
Yes, sir. It is visible.
Okay, so I was talking about the gamma motor neuron activity. So we will see in detail, how this is important in the maintenance of tone. Okay, and how what happens when there's a pathological manifestation of tone. Okay, so there are two things. If you define tone as the resistance which is offered to a passive movement, there are essentially two things which contribute towards that resistance. Okay, or two different entities which contribute towards that resistance which is offered. The first one is basically the passive properties. Now, passive properties are those properties of the musculotendinous structure which are not dependent upon, like generation of ATP or utilization of ATP. For example, the inherent stiffness which is there in tendons and other connective tissue structures which are associated with muscle, like the intramuscular septum, okay, or the musculotendinous junction, the tendons, etc. The inherent stiffness or elasticity, elastic properties of those structures, okay, they essentially offer a resistance to extension, or offer a resistance to basically being passively stretched. Okay, so that is the first property which contributes towards the resistance which is offered to passive movement. The second kind of properties arise out of, like increased formation of cross bridges, okay, through reflex, voluntary or involuntary muscle activation. Okay, so that is what it is. Okay, so active properties are essentially characterized by an increased cross bridge formation within the contractile part of the muscle. Okay, now that increased cross bridge formation has to be regulated by neural control. That neural control can be reflex, it can be voluntary, or it can be involuntary. So these are the two factors which essentially contribute towards the resistance which is offered to passive movements when you're trying to move a segment or a limb passively. Okay, now what you need to know is that, okay, when you are talking about a hypertonia, okay, or like see, when you talk about hypertonia, the most common thing which you are alluding to is basically spasticity. Now whenever you're talking about hypertonia or an increased resistance to you know a passive movement, okay, you essentially are looking at a combination of these two. We will, when we learn the pathophysiology, we will see how that happens. Okay, we are going, what we need to understand is that we are going to see a combination, a combined effect of increasing the passive resistance which is offered, as well as like the active resistance that can be offered by the muscle. Okay, now in the case of an abnormal tone, it is mostly involuntary or reflexive. Voluntarily you are not going to produce a spasticity, it has to be either reflexive or involuntary. So now changes of muscle tone, essentially when we are talking towards talking about an increase in muscle tone, like now these, all these terms are usually used interchangeably under a single term which is called as spasticity. Okay, so when we essentially are talking about spasticity, okay, unknowingly or knowingly, we tend to classify these four different phenomenon under the same term of spasticity, but neurophysiologically they are different entities. Okay, now spasticity per se, you would all know the definition is a velocity dependent increase in the tone which is associated with an exaggerated tendon jerks. Okay, and it happens because of hyper excitability of the stretch reflex. And it is one component of the upper motor neuron syndrome. Okay, and this definition was given by Lance in 1980. Now, it is velocity dependent means, when you are trying to move a joint, you have a choice to move. Imagine you're going to a patient, okay, and again we'll take the example of elbow. So you want to go for an elbow extension, okay, you want to extend the patient's elbow now from a flex position. Now when you're doing it, you have a choice of doing it at different speeds. As a therapist, okay, you can move the joint at different speeds. You can move it at a very slow pace or a very slow angular velocity, or you can basically move it at a slightly more angular velocity, or you can basically go for a quick movement. Now, by definition of spasticity, the resistance which is offered to the movement would progressively increase as you increase the speed at which you are giving the passive movement. So faster a passive movement is applied, greater will be the resistance which is offered. Okay, and that phenomenon is typically what spasticity is. So it is essentially not just an increase in tone. It is not just an increase, elevated tone which is persistent, but neurophysiologically, the exact definition of spasticity is, when you perform a passive movement, there is going to be a velocity dependent increase in the resistance which is offered. Velocity dependent in the sense the velocity with which you are moving. Okay, depending on that velocity, the resistance offered can be more or less, and that exactly what is spasticity. So, the next term is basically dystonia. Now, when you go to a stroke patient, okay, if you see a synergistic pattern, you see that the patient's upper extremities, for example, like the scapula is elevated, the shoulder is abducted, internal rotated, the elbow is flexed, okay, the forearm is pronated, the wrist is flexed, okay, and it is in that posture. What you need to understand is that whatever you are witnessing is not because of a passive movement being applied at various speeds. It is something which is present at rest. So so would you be able to call it as a spasticity? By technical definition of spasticity, you wouldn't be able to call it as spasticity. It is something else which is called as dystonia. A dystonia is a static or dynamic change to muscle tone which is caused by involuntary activation of the CNS, mostly by extrapyramidal regions, that is the basal ganglia. Now, when you are looking at a patient with a posturing, okay, you are essentially looking at a dystonic posturing. So, by definition, spasticity is technically, an observed increase in the resistance offered to passive movements with increase in velocity of movement. Okay, but dystonia is basically a manifestation of an increased tone, which can be present statically, as in the case of, like I told you, a stroke patient who's showing signs of a flexion synergy or a mixed synergy. What I explained is a mixed synergy rather than a flexion synergy. Okay, or it can be dynamic, like in the case of an athetoid cerebral palsy. They can be like fluctuations in the activation of agonist and antagonist. Okay, so that is what basically a dystonia is. Now the next one is basically a contracture. Now contracture could be in chronic cases, that is the single most factor which is responsible for offering a resistance to a movement of a joint, or offering a resistance to passive movement. Okay, now contracture technically happens in the non-neural part of the muscle. Non-neural in the sense those parts which are under the influence of nerve. Okay, it happens in those parts, okay, which, like the tendon, like this, the intramuscular septa, okay, those connective tissue as parts of the muscle where there is collagen, elastin, and proteoglycans, which are the basic connective tissue components. The changes in the relative proportion, the way they are polymerized, and the way in which they are geometrically arranged in the matrix leads to contractures. Okay, now the most common phenomenon which is associated with contractures is an excessive cross linkages forming between the strands of collagen. Okay, that is the physical reality of a tightness. When you simply put it as, you call it as a muscle tightness. All of you will have a hamstring muscle tightness, or most of you will have. Essentially, it is not spasticity. That arises not because there is an excessive cross bridges. When you say a hamstring tightness, it is not because there is excessive sliding over happening in the actin myosin filaments of your hamstring. That is not what it is. What exactly is happening is, there is a greater cross linkage formation in the collagenous part of your muscle, which essentially is part of the passive elements of the muscular tissue, that is tendons and other muscular tendinous junctions, the enthesis and other aspects, which essentially connects a muscle or transmits the force from a contractile element into the bone. Okay, so that is where it really happens. Okay, so the changes in the molecular polymerization, the way in which those things are arranged within the matrix, like the collagen, elastin, etc., and the changes in relative proportion. Okay, relative proportion, or the changes in hydration status of connective tissues, highly related to the amount of proteoglycan which is present. So all those factors leads to contractures, or the so-called tightness which you experience. Okay, now this is what leads to an absolute limitation of passive range of motion later on in a condition which can cause a spasticity for that matter, or a dystonia for that matter. Okay, for example, if the same stroke patient whom I was talking about, who is exhibiting a flexion synergy, if you leave him untreated or unattended for a prolonged period of time, ultimately what is going to happen is that there is going to be a development of or progression of contractures in such a way that the available passive range of motion will be severely limited. Okay, and at that point of time, it has nothing to do with the actin myosin cross linkage formation or anything. It is just because the connective tissue property has changed, the muscle length has been readjusted to a new length, and it is essentially a structural change which has happened in the connective tissue part of the muscle. Okay, the last one is essentially a spasm, which is a lasting muscle activity which is elicited by a sensory event. Now a spinal cord injury patient you're going to see, what you do is that you want to make him stand, or a stroke patient, imagine you want to make the patient stand. Okay, the moment the patient's foot touches the floor, the ankle goes for a plantar flexion, the knee goes for an extension, the hip goes for a rigid extension. Okay, now this again cannot be attributed to spasticity by definition. Okay, because again it is not dependent on the velocity of passive movement, but it is elicited because of a sensory response which is other than joint movement. Your floor, your foot contacting the floor is basically an exteroceptive stimulus. So in response to an exteroceptive stimulus rather than a proprioceptive stimulus, what has happened is that there has been a elevation in the muscle tone of certain muscles. Okay, now this lasting muscle activity which can be elicited by a sensory event, like the one which I gave example of. Okay, when you touch the foot to the floor, okay, there's going to be a reflexive activity of the extensor muscles. Okay, that is essentially what is called as a spasm, or in this parlance, that is what would be called as a term as a spasm rather than spasticity. Now the sensory stimulus needing be from the exteroceptors, like I told you, from the foot or palm or anything like that. It can also be from visceral structures like a full bladder, like a impacted stool, or anything which is there. In the case of spinal cord injury, especially a bladder which is full. Okay, which is a spastic bladder. Okay, which cannot void and it is full. Okay, and it's stretched, or a stool which is hardened like a piccolith, and essentially causing sensory stimulus from the gastrointestinal passage. Okay, all can lead to this specific contractions which you see, which are long-lasting muscular activity which are elicited by sensory events. Okay, so this is what you need to know, or you should know the difference between these terms when you are talking about an elevation in tone. Okay, now comes the difficult part, or supposedly the difficult part, that is the regulation of tone, or physiology of tone regulation, how exactly it is regulated. Okay, now what I want you to know is, what you need to consider is that the tone, like I told you, is essentially like a persistent isometric contraction. We saw the definition before, and a contraction of the extrafusal muscle fiber is basically brought about by an alpha motor neuron activity. Okay, now when you talk about the contraction of an extrafusal muscle fiber which is capable of applying force onto a bone, okay, is always brought about by an alpha motor neuron activity. Okay, now when you look at tone, okay, you have to understand that we are looking at various factors which are going to influence the input into the extrafusal muscle fiber or the alpha motor neuron activity of the muscle. Okay, take for example, if you are talking about the biceps, the part of the muscle which you see bulked up when you go to a gym or when you exercise, consider that as the extrafusal muscle fiber. Now the motor neuron which comes from the anterior horn, which essentially supplies this muscle fibers and which makes you capable of doing voluntary movements, is the alpha motor neuron, which are large diameter motor neurons. Okay, now tone is also produced by the same mechanism. It is essentially a controlled input of the alpha motor neuron into the extrafusal muscle fibers. Now, when you're talking about tone, all you need to know is the regulation of this input of alpha motor neuron into the extrafusal muscle fiber. Okay, now we have to see what all factors would regulate or control the input of alpha motor neuron into the extrafusal muscle fiber. Okay, so what we need to see is that, like, uh, what all, so what all are, what all influences, or what all makes a synapse with the, what all makes a synapse with the alpha motor neuron. Okay, so the regulation of the alpha motor neuron activity will always be by factors which are, like, going to, like, synapse with the alpha motor neuron, because the neurons, or the constituents which are going to synapse with the alpha motor neuron, they are the ones which are going to regulate the alpha motor neuron activity. Now we'll see one by one what are the synapses that an alpha motor neuron receives actually. Okay, now you can see, like, you can essentially see, like, the alpha motor neuron, basically here, this, you know um, these two neurons which you see at the innermost, I don't know whether you are able to see my cursor. Are you able to see my cursor? Nancy, can you see, when I move the cursor,
Yes,
is it
yes, sir. Sir,
okay?
it is
I'm
visible.
going to use it as a pointer. So here the tuning fork shaped thing which is there, okay, that is, like, this outermost layer, what you see is the extrafusal muscle fiber. Okay, and this is the intrafusal muscle fiber. Okay, now it is obviously, like, natural representation is represented one inside the other, the intrafusal muscle fibers being inside the extrafusal muscle fiber. Okay, now the nerve fibers which are terminating on the extrafusal muscle fiber, or this tuning fork shaped things, are the alpha motor neurons, or the alpha efferents, that you can see the innermost two neurons here, this and this are the alpha efferents. Okay, now what we need to see is that, we can see that, like, it essentially is, so we have, again, the alpha efferents have been divided into two: phasic alpha efferents and tonic alpha efferents. Now, what is phasic alpha efferent is, like, phasic muscle contraction is basically a contraction which is short, which is of short duration. For example, you want to pick up your cell phone from, like, the table. Okay, the muscles which permit you to do that, okay, for reaching towards the table, are all contracting or undergoing a phasic contraction. Okay, it is not a sustained muscle contraction, but rather it is, a contraction which would stop once you have achieved your motor target. Okay, so a quick movement or any kind of movement which you see is basically a phasic muscle contraction. A tonic muscle contraction is essentially a sustained muscle contraction. Okay, as the name suggests, it is going to be to maintain the tone. Okay, or increase or decrease the tone. That is what a tonic muscle contraction is. So we have two kinds of alpha motor neurons here. Okay, phasic alpha motor neurons and tonic alpha motor neurons. And I don't know whether you were able to see or not, like, actually the phasic alpha motor neurons will be of largest size. Okay, and they will have larger motor units also. So, but either way, now we can see, so we see that, like, these are essentially getting, like, these are essentially getting like if you take the basic alpha motor neuron, it is getting only one synapse. It is getting only one synapse, because I told you all those things which are going to synapse with the alpha motor neuron are going to influence its input into the muscle. And you see that it is receiving only one synapse. Okay, and that synapse essentially comes from, if you trace this neuron back, you can see that that neuron is basically coming from the intrafusal muscle fibers, okay. Now, and that fiber is actually a thick sensory fiber, or the thickest of the sensory fiber, called as 1A fiber. Okay, now you can see that there are three kinds of intrafusal muscle fibers. Okay, there are three kinds of intrafusal muscle fibers. There is, the ones which have the bulged center. Okay, the bulged centers are called nuclear bag fibers, since this looks like a bag. Okay, the center looks like a bag, they're called as the nuclear bag fibers. And here you can see that here the nuclei are not like contained in a bag. Here if you look at it, you can see that the nuclei are like it is in a bag. Here it is like the nuclei placed in a chain, and these are called as the nuclear chain fibers. Okay, now the 1A afferents which supply the alpha motor neuron, which is basically supplying the extrafusal muscle fiber, the basic muscle fiber, essentially gets innervation from both the DNB, that is dynamic, nuclear bag fibers, and static nuclear bag fibers. Okay, static nuclear bag fibers. Okay, as well as something called as the nuclear chain fibers. Okay, these are the three kinds of intrafusal muscle fibers which are there. So the sensory nerves which arise from there, they are going to basically produce a single synapse with the the alpha motor neuron, which moves towards the extrafusal muscle fiber, or which is responsible for a phasic contraction. Okay, so it receives only one input. Okay, now this is what is called as the monosynaptic reflex arc. So essentially the input from the nuclear bag and chain fibers, okay, or the nuclear bag and chain fibers, you can see that something spiral there. There is something which is called as spiral ending, or it is basically the class 1 nerve ending. Okay, they basically send information via the 1A neurons towards the spinal cord, and it makes the synapse with the alpha motor neuron, which supplies the phasic extrafusal muscle fiber, and that is essentially is what is called as the monosynaptic reflex arc. And now when you are doing a tendon jerk, okay, essentially you can see that the annulospiral nerve endings which are there. So there's a sensory nerve coming and spiraling around the nuclear bag and nuclear chain. Okay, so what happens is that when this intrafusal muscle fiber is stretched, okay, or a stretch is applied to the intrafusal muscle fibers, this long axis, what happens is that it will depolarize the 1A fiber. That 1A fiber will send the information towards the alpha motor neuron, and the alpha motor neuron will basically be depolarized, and that depolarization will lead to a contraction of the same muscle. This is the monosynaptic reflex arc, and that basically is responsible for what you see as tendon jerks. Okay, to put an example of the most simplest manifestation. Okay, is basically what you would see in a tendon. But this is not just limited to tendon jerks. Okay, now all the activities of the phasic muscle is regulated by connections which come from here. Okay, you can see that it is not receiving any other connections. Okay, excuse me please. Ma'am, I'm in the middle of a webinar. I'm taking a webinar. What happened, ma'am? Okay. Yes. Is there a patient or something? Okay, fine. Yes. Sorry, I got a call. So, you can see that, all the activities of the phasic alpha motor neuron is regulated by the input which comes from the 1A fibers. Okay. Now, the tonic alpha motor neuron, it receives basically, you can see that there is no direct input from the peripheral receptors into the tonic alpha motor neuron. Okay, basically for tonic alpha motor neuron, there are type 2 fibers, okay, which arise from the nuclear chain, okay, and they essentially, like, synapse with an interneuron in the spinal cord. Okay, that interneuron basically, like, is stimulating the alpha motor neuron, which is responsible for regulating the tone. Now the tonic alpha motor neuron also receives an input from the 1A fiber, okay, again through an interneuron, and that is what is causing that is what is regulating the input from the uh, regulating the input from the tonic alpha motor neuron into the extrafusal muscle fiber. Okay, now you can see that the activity of the intrafusal muscle fibers is regulated by another neuron which arises from the spinal cord. See, now you can see this vague outline is out of the spinal cord. Okay, from the ventral horn itself, there is another neuron system which is arising. Okay, and this neuron system is essentially, like, supplying the intrafusal muscle fiber. Now this is basically called as the gamma motor neuron system. Okay, now gamma motor neuron system is basically under the control of the supraspinal influence. That is the various tracks which descend through the spinal cord. They control the gamma motor neuron system. Now I'll tell you what essentially the gamma motor neurons do to simply understand. See, you can see that the gamma motor neurons have a plate-like ending on the ends of the intrafusal muscle fiber. Now what the gamma motor neuron does is that the gamma motor neuron will basically cause a contraction of these polar aspects of the intrafusal muscle fiber. Now, when from both sides, when the polar aspect is contracting, you can see that the central region will be stretched, because the muscle will contract from here. The intrafusal muscle fiber will contract from here, as well as it will contract from here. So what is going to happen is that the center is going to stretch, and the stretch of the central region will lead to a firing of the 1A and 2 afferents, and that will constantly send impulses into the cord. Either it will cause a monosynaptic reflex activation of the extrafusal muscle fiber, or both together, and this is what is responsible for the normal maintenance of tone. So if you essentially cut the gamma afferents off, what is going to happen is that this is only going to respond to a stretch which is achieved, which is applied passively. Okay, only the passive stretch it should be responsive to, because at rest the gamma afferents are the ones which are responsible for producing a stretch in the center. That is being cut off. So you will have, like, no tone, like, per se, if you put it in a perfectly resting position with no influence of stretch. But a minor stretch will basically elicit the monosynaptic stretch reflex as well as the tonic stretch reaction. Okay, and it is going to cause an increase in tone. Okay, now what you need to look at is, like, how all could tone increase in this scenario. Okay, what all could lead to an increase in tone in this scenario? I said that the descending supraspinal influence is on the gamma motor neuron system. That means it will regulate the input of the gamma motor neuron into the intrafusal muscle fiber. Thereby, it will regulate the length of the intrafusal muscle fiber, and hence, the input from the 1A and 2 fibers into the spinal cord, thereby regulating the tone. Okay, now if this supraspinal influences are lost, if there is a loss of the supraspinal influences on the gamma motor neuron system, okay, the gamma motor neuron system is basically, like, left to act by itself. Now this is what you are talking about when you basically talk about disinhibition. When you say that, like, in a spinal cord injury there's disinhibition of the inhibitory mechanisms, again, this is what exactly means. Okay, now it is through the gamma motor neuron system that, like, the activity of the alpha motor neuron is actually influenced by the central nervous system. And when this superior influence is cut off, there is going to be a dysregulation of tone. There is going to be a dysregulation of tone, because the gamma motor neuron system is left to act by itself. Okay, so whatever happens is definitely going to happen, okay, because of this local circuitry which is there. There is no control from above. Okay, I hope that was good enough for you to understand. I don't know how far it is a very confusing thing, but like, hopefully I could explain it to you in a simple manner. Okay, now we will see. But when we are talking about the supraspinal influences in this diagram, what we are talking about, to simplify it or to not confuse it much more, I have divided it into those things which can put an excitatory input into the gamma motor neuron system, and those which can put an inhibitory input into the gamma motor neuron system. So you can see that the cortical fibers which project onto the ventromedial reticular formation, okay, up to ventromedial reticular formation, okay, basically can cause an inhibitory influence on the gamma motor neuron system. Okay, so it usually comes down through the reticulospinal tract. Now what you need to understand is that if you have a pure corticospinal tract lesion, okay, you are not going to see a spasticity. Okay, so how do we know it? Because we have done a lot of experiments on cats and monkeys and all, where what they have done is that at various levels they have cut the corticospinal tract and seen what basically happens. So if you usually, it is said that if you really go for a pure isolated corticospinal tract lesion, you would see a loss of dexterity or involved what do you call it, is inability to produce a voluntary contraction, and the muscle tone would usually be subnormal. It will be less than what is normal. Okay, but the disinhibitory effect usually comes, or the inhibitory effect essentially comes through the lateral cortical, through the reticulospinal tract. The reticulospinal tract essentially produces a inhibitory effect on the gamma motor neuron system. Okay, now, like, the facilitatory effect essentially comes from the bulbopontine tegmentum. Okay, so through the medial the medial reticulospinal tract and the vestibulospinal tract, they are the ones which are going to influence the like increased activity of alpha motor neurons. Okay, so what you need to know is that normal tone is basically a balanced activity of the input of the dorsal reticulospinal tract and the bulbopontine and vestibular nucleus into the gamma motor neuron activity, and that is what the normal tone is. So any mechanism which can affect one or all the three, or like cause an imbalance between the distribution of these activities, is going to manifest as a abnormality of tone. That's what you need to understand. So what are the mechanisms for hypertonia? We already said that there are the mechanical changes which are intrinsic to the muscle. Okay, so when you are trying to move a limb, okay, imagine you are going to a stroke patient and you are trying to do a lower limb flexion. Okay, so you are holding at the foot, you are holding at the knee and trying to flex. Now the resistance to that movement will be offered by the mechanical changes intrinsic to the muscles, or mechanical factors intrinsic to the muscle. First is the physical inertia. The inertia is dependent upon the mass. Now obviously, like a person who has had a stroke 3 days back is not going to have a change in the mass of the lower extremity. So there should be something else. The second thing is basically the mechanical elasticity of connective tissue, which we already discussed. Okay, the neural mechanism is the neural mechanisms which are responsible for hypertonia or hypertonicity are like increase excitatory postsynaptic potentials from 1A and 2 muscle spindle afferents. Like if that is if there is postsynaptic, means like after the synapse is made. So if there is an increased excitation, okay, of these alpha afferents, okay, because of some reason, so that means a small input which comes from 1A will produce a large response from the alpha motor neuron. Okay, so that is one of the mechanisms. Second is decreased postsynaptic inhibitory potential from interneuronal connection of the antagonist. Okay, now what I forgot to tell you is that, see, these interneurons which you see here, okay, they essentially are inhibited by the antagonistic muscle. Now something which is called as reciprocal inhibition. I hope you would have heard of the term reciprocal inhibition. Now the reciprocal inhibition is essentially like when you are trying to, say for example, like extend the elbow again, like when you're trying to extend the elbow, so there is a normal resting tone of the flexors. Okay, So if this resting tone in the flexors, I'm talking about an active extension of the elbow. When you're talking about an active extension of the elbow, so when you basically are talking about an active extension of the elbow, like uh, essentially, like there's going to be a resistance which is offered by the resting tone of plexus. Now, unless and until this resting tone is not inhibited, you have to expend more ATP to produce a elbow extension. Okay, so when we are going for an elbow extension, there has to be a simultaneous relaxation of the elbow flexors. Now that is what is called as a reciprocal inhibition. Okay, so the antagonistic muscle, when it is trying to contract, will basically inhibit the same muscle through this interneuron actually. Okay, so if this reciprocal inhibition is lost, excuse me please. Sorry for this. If the reciprocal inhibition is lost, the loss of reciprocal inhibition, okay, also causes an increase in excitation of the alpha motor neuron system. Okay, so one of the characteristic features is like there is a lack of reciprocal inhibition which is seen in like spasticity. So one of the mechanisms is the reciprocal inhibition, okay, is lost. Now, the third mechanism is decreased presynaptic inhibition by the descending fibers, which we already saw. The descending fibers can inhibit the alpha motor neuron, sorry, the gamma motor neuron. Now, the gamma motor neuron can basically, an inhibition of gamma motor neuron will basically reduce the length of the intraphyseal muscle fibers. So 1A and 2 fiber input into the spinal cord reduces, and that would basically lead to a reduction in muscle tone or loss of alpha motor neuron activity. But if this inhibition is taken out, I told you if there is a lesion here somewhere, okay, so what happens is that there is no inhibitory control on the gamma motor neuron activity. A gamma motor neuron can act in a way it wants. What is going to happen? It essentially is going to lead to an increase in resting tone of the muscles. Okay, so that is what the three neural mechanisms are, or the three causes of or the three causes why there can be an increase in tone or hypotonia. Okay, now we said that these are in detail, like increased motor neuronal excitability. What are the reasons could be happening? Because of excitatory synaptic input is enhanced. Okay, so it can be because of segmental efference, which I told you, the 1A and 2 fibers which are coming, the excitatory interneurons which are there. We saw that interneurons which are there, they can basically be too excited that they produce a greater activity than the sensory input which is being given to them. Okay, so the descending pathways go for an excessive input, okay, like the vestibulospinal tract, okay, producing an excessive input into the motor neuron. Okay, so all these things can lead to an increase in tone. Inhibitory synaptic input is reduced, like the Renshaw cell recurrent inhibition, which I told you is an interneuron within the spinal cord, okay, which essentially regulates the activity of the alpha motor neuron. If the inhibition is reduced, it is going to be cause an increase in tone. Okay, so 1A inhibitory interneurons, if there is actually a reduction in the activity, that is 1A inhibitory interneurons is basically the one which is responsible for reciprocal inhibition. Okay, so if there is a reduction in the activity of those, there is going to be an increase in tone. Okay, so if there is a reduction in 1B efferent fibers or changes in the properties of 1B efferent fibers, there is going to be an increase in tone. See, did I cut your phone when you call me? I'm sorry, I had accidentally cut this thing. I'll continue, Nancy. Can I? I'll continue, right?
Shyam sir? Yes.
I can continue. Am I audible to you?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, I will. Is my screen visible now? Again, the PPT is
Yes,
visible.
screen is visible. PPT is not visible. Yes,
Okay. Okay. Okay.
now it is
Okay.
visible.
Okay. Okay.
सर हाइड
So,
दैट नीचे वाला स्टॉप शेयरिंग वाला वहां पे हाइड है ना वो
okay,
हाइड
I'll go for a. I'll go for a this thing.
लाइट शेयर
That's fine. So, so essentially, what you need to know is that, like, spasticity, you would have seen that over a period of time. For example, a spinal cord injury patient you take. Okay. Now, when you're assessing him on the say, for example, that after the spinal shock period, obviously, like, immediately after the spinal shock period, you're assessing him. Okay. That spasticity. So you measured the spasticity on that day. Okay, so there was a spasticity. Now we know that, it is basically a disinhibition of the descending controls. Okay, so or basically in a spinal cord injury, this is what is happening. This region is cut off. Okay, this is cut off, and that is what is going to lead to a basically an increase in tone. Okay, but again, you are going after 3 months and measuring. You will see that there is an increase in the tone. Now, the reason why that happens is because plasticity is actually, like, regulated by a plastic phenomenon or plasticity phenomenon. Plasticity, you would know, it is basically the ability of the nervous system to make, morphological and physiological changes to suit a environmental perturbation or an environmental influence. Okay, so what basically happens is that since there is no input from the higher centers, okay, your body's response to increase the activity of the muscles is to basically, exaggerate all these mechanisms. What happens is that, for example, you know there is going to be greater neurotransmitters being released from the 1A and 2 fibers, probably. Okay, there might be greater expression of receptors on the alpha motor neuron, so that, a little neurotransmitter can produce a large change. Okay, or there is going to be, like, rewiring of this interneuron circuitry in such a way that it facilitates spasticity. Okay, so, all these plastic changes can occur, or, this basic networking and, like, structural changes happen within the local neural circuitry. Okay, and that is what leads to an increase in spasticity over a period of time. So don't be under the assumption that even if you don't treat or don't address spasticity, it is going to remain the same. It is not going to remain the same. Okay, even the neural mechanisms are going to adapt. Okay, there are these mechanisms which are responsible for the, like, manifestation of an elevated tone. They will be primed, or, they'll be tuned in such a way that there is an even more increase in tone. Okay, like, this is basically, this is what you need to understand, what basics, specifically what happens. So, the classification of this is the classification of positive features of upper motor neuron syndrome by pathophysiological mechanism. So, afferent or disinhibited spinal reflexes, like, that is a proprioceptive reflex, that is stretch reflex, will lead to spasticity, tendon hyperreflexia. Okay, that is, if the pathology is disinhibition of spinal reflexes, there's going to be proprioceptive reflexes, that is stretch reflexes, are disinhibited. Then there's going to be spasticity, there's going to be hyperreflexia when you do a tendon jerk. Okay, and there's going to be a clonus activity. Okay, now, there can be a clasp reaction, as well as there may or may not be a positive supporting reaction. Now, when there is cutaneous or nociceptive reflexes, which are, no, cutaneous as well as nociceptive sensory input, can also regulate the phasic as well as the tonic activity via this local interneuron connection, which we had seen before. Okay, so this area can basically be influenced by even the cutaneous input which is there. Okay, like, or the visceral input also which is there. So this leads to manifestations like flexion withdrawal, flexor spasm. Okay, Babinski sign and all. Okay, so, when there is a pathology with the efferent, like, tonic supraspinal drive, there can be spastic dystonia. For example, if it happens because of a spinal cord injury or a stroke, or a lesion of the descending controls, then essentially the manifestation would be a spastic dystonia. There can be associated reaction or sykinesia. For example, what would, under normal circumstances also we have associated reaction. For example, you're lifting a bucket of water with your left hand, your right hand also goes for abduction. That is what basically a kind of associated reaction you can talk about. Now, when you're trying to activate a group of muscles, it will produce an involuntary activation of another group of muscles. That is what an associated reaction is. Okay, so these are going to be the manifestation of pathology, which is at various levels in the central nervous system. Okay, so when we are going for evaluation of hypertonia, okay, we need to be aware of what exactly is happening. Okay, so there is going to be two different aspects which you need to think about. There is going to be reflex hyperexcitability, which is the most common reason why there's an increase in tone. There's going to be altered muscle function and altered mechanical property, both of which will lead to an increase in tone or resistance. Okay, now how we are going to evaluate the muscle tone. Now this is, especially in a clinical setting, it is very, 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 very dicey situation. Okay, now our clinical assessments are based upon the qualitative experience which we get when we are doing a passive movement, because by definition hypertonicity or tone or spasticity, everything is basically defined as what happens when you're passively moving a limb, isn't it? So our assessments also reflect that. Okay, so when we are passively moving a segment, what kind of experience, what kind of resistance you experience, okay, is what is what helps you to assess or quantify or qualitatively describe the tone. Okay, so the most common available clinical tools which are there are based on this qualitative experience of the therapist who is moving the limb. Okay, so when you're passively trying to extend an elbow, okay, the kind of resistance which you feel, or when you're passively trying to extend a knee, the kind of resistance that you feel is going to basically determine your assessment findings. Okay, so based on these qualitative experiences or clinical measurements, there are two which we are going to discuss now. One is basically the Ashworth scales. Okay, because there are two, there is Ashworth and the modified Ashworth. Now this essentially describes, if you see the points in the Ashworth scale, you can see it basically tries to describe, okay, the kind of experience that you are going to get when you're going to move a person's limb or a segment. Okay, for example, the grade 0 is there is no increase in tone at all. So when you basically move, you are not finding any kind of resistance to movement. Okay, now when you're trying to move, you feel a catch, okay, which will maybe followed by a relaxation. Okay, it is grade 1, and so on and so forth. So you can see that progressively you can see there is an increase in tone. Now the problem with this scale is that it depends a lot on the therapist who is assessing. Okay, now to give an accurate definition of what a catch would be or what a release would be, okay, it is impossible to essentially it is a subjective experience, in the sense you are doing it, you feel a catch. I am doing it, I may not feel a catch. Okay, or I may feel a catch much before you feel. Okay, so all the subjective factors come into play when you are doing this evaluation. Okay, so it has it essentially depends a lot on the skills of the evaluator. Okay, it also depends upon the velocity at which you are moving the limb. Okay, so Ashworth definitely hasn't told about the critical velocity at which you have to move the limb or anything like that. Okay, so you're moving slower, obviously, since spasticity is a velocity dependent phenomenon, you're going to feel less resistance. I move at a slightly faster velocity, I'm going to find a greater resistance or a more higher manifestation of spasticity. So what you need to know is this essentially is a scale which it's an ordinal scale. It's an ordinal scale in the sense you are ranking your experience from 0 to 4. There's a ranking of the experience. So, it's a 0 to 4, it's not a nominal scale, it's an ordinal scale, but it tries to rate the therapist experience, what, he feels when he's trying to passively move the limb or the joint segment of a patient. Okay, so that is what Ashworth is. Now, this is the most commonly used scale for documenting spasticity or evaluating spasticity in clinical settings. Okay, now the second scale or the second assessment method is known as the Tardieu method. Now, Tardieu method is more extensive than Ashworth actually. So in this, it recognizes all aspects of spasticity. It all recognizes all aspects of spasticity, in the sense it recognizes that spasticity is because of both neural as well as non-neural mechanisms. Okay, it recognizes that spasticity is dependent upon the velocity at which the movement takes place. Okay, so all these factors it takes into consideration for assessment. Now, for doing a Tardieu method of rating spasticity, what you have to do is that you have to go for two sequential stretches. Okay, one is going to be at a very slow velocity. The second one is going to be at a faster velocity. Now, there are two fast velocity stretches you can do. One can be a free fall of the limb, or you can just let the limb fall, okay, with gravity. Okay, and the second can be basically a velocity which is greater than the free fall velocity. Okay, so you are going to passively move the limb at a speed which is greater than the free fall speed. Okay, now when you're doing this, there are two things you are going to note. The first thing is that, the first thing is basically you're going to rate the quality of resistance which is offered to you. Okay, so it is rated on this particular scale. That is at the 0 is no resistance to 4 is basically infatigable clonus occurring at a precise angle. Okay, so you're essentially going to rate first and foremost the quality of resistance you're going to feel. Secondly, what you're going to feel is that you say that you're going to move the velocity, move the joint at two different velocities. Now, what you need to know is that when you're moving a joint, there is going to be a definitive end to the range of motion. For example, when you're moving elbow from 140 degrees of flexion, it definitively is going to stop at 0. Okay, so that is the maximum range which you can move through. That's the end range. Okay, now when you are moving a joint, if it is spastic, you would start feeling a resistance much before this end range has reached. Okay, that is the understanding which you need to have. Okay, so when you start moving much before the end range is reached, okay, you will start feeling a resistance. Okay, now the end range is because of lack of any more extensibility in the tissue. Okay, that's the reason the end range is, or it can be because of a bony approximation, as in the case of elbow, the olecranon fossa being filled with the olecranon process. Okay, but whatever happens in the middle is because of the neural regulation or the muscle tightness which could be there. Okay, now when you are moving a joint at a slower velocity and a faster velocity, at a faster velocity you feel that there is an early onset of this resistance followed by an increased resistance throughout. Okay, but in slower movement there is the resistance which is there within the range happens at a much later part of the range, and then there is a lesser increase in tone. That essentially means that the muscle is spastic, because the velocity dependent increase in tone is because of spasticity. If there is no difference in the manifestation of the resistance within the range, okay, it happens nearer to the actual physiological end range, and it is not actually altered by the velocity at which you are moving the limb, then it is not because of the neural phenomenon, but because of the connective tissue changes which has occurred. Okay, that is, it is because of the so-called tightness or contracture which you say. Okay, that is what is responsible for the resistance which is offered to the passive movement. So, that is basically about a Tardieu scale, or how we're going to apply, or how we're going to assess using a Tardieu method. Okay, now, the next is biomechanical approaches. It is essentially going to be done in laboratory settings. Okay, the first one is basically Wartenberg method. Now, Wartenberg method involved making a person sitting in high sitting. Okay, now dropping the knee from an extended position down towards gravity. So when you are dropping it, he says that the knee will basically oscillate like a pendulum, and there will be approximately 6 oscillations before the oscillations are completely dampened out and the knee comes to a stop. So his proposition was that if there are less than six oscillations happening before the dampening occurs, then there is a hypertonicity. That is what his assumption was. Okay, so that is what is called as the pendular method of assessment. So you drop the limb in a position towards gravity, and you see how many free oscillations happen. Now it is applicable only for the knee joint, or else you'll have to position the other joints in such a way that you can actually do the same method there. Okay, that is one method. The second is basically powered systems like isokinetic dynamometers and all. What it does is that you try to passively, a machine tries to passively extend your joint or passively move your joint, and the resistance which is offered will be measured, okay, and documented. So when instead of you moving, a machine can move, and it can very precisely measure the resistance which is offered to movement. Okay, and that is what powered systems do. Again, that is possible in a laboratory setting only. Okay, now the next one is neurophysiological methods. One of the most common ways to assess for an increased tone is, if it is because of increased reflex hyper reflexia, then it is like tendon jerks. Hyperreflexia will be associated with exaggerated reflexes, not always, because if it has dystonic increase in tone, okay, like it's a dystonia which you are predominantly seeing, the tendon jerks needing be increased. Okay, but it is what happens with pure spasticity, that is there is going to be an increase in the exaggeration of the tendon jerks. Okay, the next is neurophysiological, basically electromyography based. H reflex is basically like sending an afferent impulse into the spinal cord, especially the calf, and then trying to record the electrical activity which happens through the efferent impulse which is coming to the calf, okay, by means of an electrode. Okay, so H reflex to M response. So now M response is an electromyographic response elicited by a supramaximal stimulation of the muscle. Okay, so the ratio of H reflex to M response will basically let you identify if this is spasticity or not. Okay, obviously to go into details of it is going to be too much, so I'm not going to speak about it much. But H reflex, essentially an increase in the motor output when you are going for a sensory stimulation in H reflex shows that there is hyperexcitability of the alpha motor neurons which are there. Okay, so which amounts to spasticity or hyperreflexia, because that is what you need to know. So this ratio will be increased, okay, when there is a spasticity. So now we come to the physiotherapy management, like what we are going to exactly do as a management. Now the thing is that I'm not going to talk to you about schools of thought like NDT or or PNF, or like I'm not going to do that here, because those are extensive subjects on your own. But I'm just going to give you the basic premises on which your management needs to be based. Okay, so we know, first and foremost, what we need to know is basically a clear understanding of what all these terms actually means, what you're going to treat. Okay, so you need to know what we are treating. Okay, a clear understanding of what we are treating we need to know. Okay, now how we are going to address the biomechanical factors which are associated with increase in tone. We said that an elevated tone is basically a mixture of the biomechanical increase in resistance plus the alteration in properties of the neural network. Okay, so both are there. So here we are going to talk about, the connective tissue aspects of an elevated tone. Now how we are going to manage that per se. Okay, what would you do to essentially address the connective tissue factors? Now they need to be addressed, because studies have shown that within 2 weeks of the onset of a stroke, essentially there is going to be changes in the passive biomechanical factors which are associated with increase in tone. There is going to be changes within those systems. Okay, so you need to address this at any cost. Now how we are going to address it? Okay, so we basically can talk in terms of 3 different aspects. Now it is put as it is just mentioned as 3 factors: stretch, position, splints, and thermal agents. But we need to understand what we are trying to do here. So I said that, essentially, like the the biomechanical factors or the passive factors which are associated with an elevated tone is because of change in the molecular cross linkage, the way in which the collagen is laid out, increase in collagen cross linkage, etc., which leads to basically a manifestation of tightness or the non-neural factors of hypertonia. Now, how we are going to address that? Okay, so what you need to do is that you need to essentially break the intermolecular bonds which are there. Okay, you have to break the intermolecular bonds which are there. You have to mechanically move the collagen to a newer arrangement and then let it basically form new bonds there. Okay, now very easy to understand proteinaceous structure which is similar to collagen would be like your hair. Okay, so the keratin is made up of a protein called as keratin, a polymerized protein called as keratin. Now what you essentially do to straighten your hair. Okay, how does a hair straightener work? Have you ever thought? What essentially it does is that the curliness or frizziness of hair is because of the hydrogen bonds or covalent bonds which are formed between various opposing aspects of this keratin strand. Okay, now adding heat to that essentially destabilizes the covalent bonds, okay, or the hydrogen bonds for that matter. And when you are applying a mechanical stress by means of a comb or or by pressing or whatever, okay, it essentially lets you to reposition the hair strand into a new position, and that is how straightening occurs by a normal thermal hair straightener. Okay, when you are doing to permanently chemically block the bonding of this, then it is called as a debonding, which you can do by a chemical straightening of your hair. Now the same thing can be not a chemical straightening, but what you can do is the same thing can be applied to collagen also. So what you can do is that, see, we know that the intermolecular bonds or the interfibrillar bonds which are formed in collagen are thermosensitive. Okay, so heating to a temperature greater than 40 degrees, so any kind of heat which can heat the collagenous structure to greater than 40 degrees of temperature, but less than 45, because obviously that's going to cause a denaturing. Okay, is going to basically weaken the collagen bonds which are there. So increasing the temperature of the tissue, okay, followed by a mechanical stretch is actually going to cause a lengthening of the connective tissue part. Okay, so that is there. But the thing is that as we know that the connective tissue tightness is not in isolation, it happens in association with the neural factors. So what happens is that the reflexive pattern will again pull the limb back into a flex position or a shortened position. So that is the reason positioning and splinting are important. When you position or splint the part, what essentially is going to happen is that whatever length you have gained, it is going to remain. Okay, so stretching with the thermal agent with positioning and splinting can essentially prevent 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 the development of connective tissue contractures or increase in the tone by means of biomechanical factors. Okay, now how we are going to, what are you going to do to reduce the neural excitability, or exercise control over the neural factors which lead to reciprocal inhibition. Okay, now neural factors which lead to increase in tone. Okay, so the basic idea is to promote, the basic idea is to promote reciprocal inhibition. Okay, the basic idea is to promote reciprocal inhibition. Okay, so how do you promote reciprocal inhibition is, I told you, reciprocal inhibition is something which is absent in a condition where there is spasticity. So for example, when you are trying to move a spastic upper limb, if you are trying to flex your elbow is not flexing because there is no relaxation of extensors. Okay, so there's a lack of reciprocal inhibition. So what are the ways to basically promote reciprocal inhibition? Now one of the most common method which you can adapt, which has the backing of evidence, is strengthening of the agonist muscle, especially explosive strengthening. Now there's a person called as Professor Jen Bo Nielsen. He's a expert in movement neurophysiology. Okay, you can find his videos on YouTube. Okay, and he has published a paper in published a paper in 2008, which basically was the effect of explosive strength training on the reciprocal inhibition of plantar flexors. So the explosive strength training of dorsiflexors, how it basically leads to increase in reciprocal inhibition of plantar flexors, because when you're doing a dorsiflexion, you need to have a reciprocal inhibition of plantar flexors to move. And he showed that there is definitive change within 2 weeks of starting an exercise. Okay, so going for a strength training, and now strength training must emphasize on two factors. One is resistance, other one is velocity. Okay, so greater the velocity of a muscle contraction, greater is going to be the recruitment. So explosive strength training, that's what it's called. So strength training which is especially explosive in nature, okay, which basically is done at a high velocity of the agonistic muscle, will lead to a greater reciprocal inhibition, or it will promote factors leading to a reciprocal inhibition of the antagonist over a period of time. Okay, now the spasticity of the antagonist may not reduce, but the reciprocal inhibition will basically increase. Okay, so that is what is going to happen. So promotion of activities, okay, which emphasizes on strength. Okay, now functional orientation, you basically make the person practice again and again and again, okay, in the desired movement patterns, or movement combination which you want, okay, to achieve a certain function. Okay, so basically this is going to lead to a functional decrement of functional ability. So you train the person repeatedly with enforced practice for functional orientation. Okay, that also leads to a promotion of reciprocal inhibition. Now the third one is basically an area which is still under dispute, an electrical stimulation. Excuse me. Yes, Nancy. I'm sorry, I got disconnected from it. So this is the last part. Okay, I just want to finish it off. So what I was discussing about was
Share your screen. Share your screen.
I'm not able to see it right now. One second, I am doing it.
Screen is visible. PPT.
Is it visible now?
Yes, yes, perfect, perfect.
Yeah. So electrical stimulation. Now we told that electrical stimulation can be used, because I told you explosive strength training can lead to